Hello, today we have none other than Mr. Chris Hope, who has a very personal topic that's close to his heart, which is the topic of social connection. Chris, maybe you can introduce yourself.
Sure, thank you so much, Arjun, and thanks for having me as well. Yes, my topic today is around social connection. I'm a current lecturer at RMIT University and also working at the University of Melbourne. In relation to this topic, I am a graduate of the University of Cambridge, where my thesis focused on loneliness in vulnerable groups, loneliness in migrants specifically. But prior to that, I also, and I'm still doing a project where I meet a stranger a week for coffee. I'm now at almost 500 of those coffees. But after the original 100 coffees, I founded a non-profit and did quite a bit of work in the social connection space. The balance between sort of the research side there and also the personal project of meeting people for coffee, and almost 500 now.
What got you into the topic of social connection?
I think I've always been curious around the topic. For me, I was always curious as a young person around how people connect or don't connect necessarily with each other, particularly things like the supermarket and so on. But really that all came to a head in 2016, where I had quite a bad year. I was quite disconnected. I was lucky to be living with my best friend at the time, and we were talking about setting goals for the next year. One of the goals I set from the goals list was to meet 100 strangers. I was feeling quite disconnected. I was working in a job that perhaps wasn't giving me purpose. I was in a difficult relationship at the time, and so for me, I felt quite disconnected and I guess lonely as well. I decided to embark on this project to meet 100 new people. When I went back and looked at the goals list, I looked at how can I achieve that goal? And I decided that in Melbourne, coffee was a safe way to meet people. I could reach out to them on LinkedIn. And therefore I decided to embark on this journey of meeting a stranger every week for coffee. And of course, it just went from there, really. I think the first few coffees, there was nothing particularly incredible about them, but coffee number 4, which I talk about a lot, was particularly inspiring. But then they just sort of flowed together, and now it's become part of my life, is to meet a new person a week for coffee. COVID obviously was an interesting time for me as well, with doing virtual coffees or the walking coffee. So I think, to answer the question, back to the original question, I think the 100 coffees unearthed something that was already in me, this interest in social connection, this passion to understand and be very curious about people as well. And I think that's led me to lots of my work.
What made coffee number 4 particularly inspiring?
Yeah, I think, the conversation, so Steph was coffee number 4. And she asked me a question that was very powerful at the time, and I think is a very powerful question to reflect on at any time in our lives. But the question was, what are your personal values and how do they align to your career? And this was the first time that anyone had ever spoken to me about values, which was incredibly interesting for me. And I really thought it was a really powerful question because of what was going on at the time in my life. Were these things that I was doing that were aligning with my values or not? And so what I did is I went home and I actually didn't just apply it to my career, I applied it to my life more broadly. I think Steph at the time was going through some executive coaching, so it was quite a typical question that you might get asked in executive coaching around, how do your values align with what you're doing in your career, your job, etc., the people you work with. But for me, it was broader than that. It was about my life as well. So on the left-hand side, I wrote down the things I was doing in my life, the job, etc., etc. And then on the top was kind of like a matrix. At the top, I wrote my values and the things that were important to me. And then I did some ticks and crosses, and that gave me a bit of a roadmap for some next steps forward, some things to explore, some different ideas. So that's why coffee number 4 was particularly powerful. So a big shout out to Steph for that. The thing is, when I talk to her about this, the interesting part for me is you don't always know the impact you have on other people. And for her, that question was very much about, this was an executive coaching thing. She was using it for her career. But for me, it was much more pronounced than that. But I think, when she asked me that question, she probably didn't think that, which I find very fascinating, the impact that we have on other people, and we don't know the impact that we're going to have from a conversation. And sometimes if we do meet a stranger and then we have a conversation like that with them, it can change their life, but we will never know that. And that is particularly fascinating for me.
Have your values changed from coffee number 4? Have they evolved from that time till now?
I think so. I think some of my core values would still be the same, definitely. But I would also say that for me, my ability to articulate my values has definitely changed. I think values are fluid. I think values change throughout our life as we have major life changes, or we make life decisions, or even our environment can shape our values as well, and the things that are important to us at the time, I believe. So for me, they have changed, but I think a few core ones are still there. I think it's important that we give back to our community. I think that was always a very important value for me. I mean, I would describe, being curious as a value, and that came through for me with travel and so on. And of course, the Coffees Project and trying other things. And there are other values, the importance of friendship. Friendship is very important to me as well, family as well. So I think these are the kind of values that stuck, and there are others that may have moved around as well and adjusted and changed. And I think that's normal for all of us, that values are not fixed. They're more of a fluid process.
I guess kind of like purpose, right?
Sure, exactly, yeah.
It oscillates,
yes.
Whatever that may be.
Yes.
So on the topic of catching up with people for coffees, I read an article recently, it's in Canada, and they said that people who speak with strangers are 3 to 4 times happier.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that in your experience, this has actually, this kind of is parallel with what you've experienced, this kind of research? And if so, how?
Yeah, definitely. Interesting article, I think, and we also saw during COVID the removal of many of those interactions as well. I describe some of these interactions as insignificant interactions, and I use inverted commas around the insignificant because for me they're not insignificant. They may appear on the face of them insignificant. What I'm talking about here is the person on the bus, the person on the plane, the train, whatever it might be, the person in the coffee line that we can talk to. Many of these interactions, whilst on the face of them may be insignificant, they're actually incredibly powerful. I mean, you've given an example there of people that do talk to strangers, they're 3 times more happier, right, in this study. So again, that supports that there as well. In my experience, definitely, I think that connecting with strangers to me is really interesting. It's not just through the Coffees Project, but also in other examples as well. Knowing the barista, for example, at the coffee, the coffee shop that you go to, or other environments like that, is also really important. I think one thing that was unfortunate with COVID was the cutting down of a number of those casual interactions that we do have. I think beyond just the happiness piece, the interesting thing for me is that these casual interactions can change our life. An interaction with a stranger can change the way you think about the world. They can give you some amazing advice. They may have a introduction for you. Or this is something to me that's very fascinating about the world. And again, I go back to the point before that I raised about Steph. We don't often know the impact of the interaction that we've had as well on the other person. And that to me is particularly fascinating, is that we can have a conversation with someone that for them can be incredibly profound. For us, it's not so profound, but that changes their whole life, but we never know that. And I think that is something that's really interesting about the world, and that we should try to encourage these types of interactions with people and be open to those interactions as well.
Chris, on the topic of being open to those interactions,
yeah.
I have reflected with some people on the value of talking to strangers. I'm very extroverted, so I can quite comfortably talk to strangers.
Yeah.
Someone approached me and said, I really want to as well. I want to connect. I don't know how to. I'm too nervous. I'm too scared. I'm too apprehensive.
Yeah.
This person asked me for advice on how to talk to strangers. I had none. Do you have any?
I think it's a very good point to make, first of all, that the introvert-extrovert piece comes up a lot with this sort of conversation. And I think what I would say, first of all, is that social connection is a basic human need. We know that. And when you look at things like the longevity study that Harvard and other studies, social connection is consistently coming out as the number one factor. Okay, there are obviously other factors as well, diet, etc. Okay, but social connection is number one. So all human beings need social connection is the first thing that I would say. The level of social connection that we need obviously is different. Okay, so for certain people, they may be happy with less interactions, and this is where we can get into loneliness and the definition of loneliness really being around the satisfaction of our relationships. So to caveat what I'm about to say with that, I do think this is a learned skill. I do believe that people can improve. I think that talking to strangers, particularly in the society that we now live in, okay, where we are so connected digitally, but less connected in terms of a face-to-face environment. I refer to Australia or the UK or the US for these examples, and other countries as well. I think that it is a learned skill, and I think with practice you can improve. I think for me, that was another big learning of the 100 Coffees. I think for me, whilst I am very extroverted, I think the ability to ask good questions, the ability to listen, these skills were developed through this project. And I think that we're always developing those skills, and that's really important. The other thing I would say as well is that everybody has a story. Mm-hmm. And I think this comes up sometimes, and I sometimes also get asked this question around, what would I talk to somebody about? And of course we have our environment, etc., that we can talk to people about and things that are happening at the time. But I think also, we all have an interesting story, and if we can get good at asking questions of other people and just ask a few simple questions about the person, or often the advice I give when students often ask me, how do we reach out to people on LinkedIn, for example, and my response is always, ask for advice. People will always give you advice. They'll always be open to a conversation there. I think there are some examples there around where we can have some questions that we might go to or practice with people, and they can help us to unlock some of these more difficult conversations with strangers from a perspective of feeling uncomfortable about that. And I think the more you do it, the better that you get. So this is a practice, it's a learned skill, and it's something that, unfortunately, with social media and with other things in that space, this is a skill I believe now we need to teach as well. Whilst it is inherently human to connect with others, I think young people, in particular now, I'm talking about schools, etc. And before that, I think that this is a skill that definitely needs to be embedded in the curriculum, and some discussion around that. I know that I have quite a few discussions with Pamela Qualter, a professor at the University of Manchester, who's probably one of the leading researchers in the world on youth loneliness. She's done 30 years plus work in this space. And when you talk to Pamela, she talks a lot about the idea of a friendship curriculum in schools and the importance of a friendship curriculum. And I also believe that that is a very important thing that we do, not just embed in terms of schools, but also we think about how does that play out in universities and workplaces and other spaces where people connect and gather.
What does she expect the friendship curriculum to work like?
I think, not to speak on her behalf, but I think the idea would be that within schools, that the idea of making friends is a learned skill, and that we treat it like some of the other soft skills that we teach, and that we don't assume that people know how to make friends, maintain friendship, the importance of friendship throughout our life, the importance of having diverse friends as well. I'm currently working on an article around the importance of intergenerational friendships, which for me is incredibly important, to have friends of different generations, different genders, different backgrounds, and different ways of thinking. And not all of those have to be close friends, for example. So I think things like this, for me, are really important. How do we maintain a friendship? Because we talk about romantic relationships a lot. And we talk about the maintaining of romantic relationships, the importance of romantic relationships, etc. And there's nothing wrong with that, of course, they are important. But we don't talk about friendship enough. We don't have breakup songs for friendship. And a friendship breakup can be incredibly traumatic for people. Particularly a friendship breakup that's been over long. In fact, often more traumatic than a relationship breakup. Romantic partner breakup. So I think that that's really important, that we teach young people these sorts of skills and that we embed that into school curriculum and within those spaces as well.
I also echo those sentiments. I very much believe that soft skills, emotional intelligence, this is a skill that you can hone. I used to think that people are born with it, but now I don't believe that at all, because I worked as a social worker and I noticed emotional intelligence can definitely improve it, 100%.
Yep.
On the topic of the friendships, you were also, I remember, I think 2 months ago, you mentioned the value of platonic friendships. Maybe you can give a little bit of insight on what you were talking about, that value.
Sure, yeah. I think that for me, it's really important to have friendship of diverse backgrounds. I think that in certain contexts and in certain cultures, and I refer to Australian culture as one of those, the idea of intergender friendships is not something that's really discussed a lot. They sort of happen naturally, but these are really important friendships, in my opinion. I think that there are many issues in this country with violence against women, which you know a lot about through your work, and we know a lot about because it's a critical issue in this country. And I think that some of that, not to blame all of that on this, but I think some of that stems from the way that men view women, and I think that can also be not necessarily alleviated, but I think it does help if in young people the idea of making platonic friends with women, in the case of men, because they're the ones that have to change their behaviour, right? Men have to change their behaviour. That to me is something that's quite important, I believe. The reason I say platonic is because often we put an emphasis on a relationship as a man, a relationship with a woman as being either romantic or it's a work colleague. And to me, or none of those. And to me, that's incredibly toxic and dangerous when we get into that sort of thinking. So I think it's very important that we have friends of different genders and different backgrounds as well.
So you were talking about kind of ways that you can connect with people. We talked about small talk and things of this nature. You're also quite proficient in a language, Spanish, right?
I'm trying.
Trying to. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the inspiration for starting that and how that also maybe improved your ability to socially connect with others.
Yeah, I mean, Spanish for me has been a really interesting project, a personal project. 2 years ago, I started Spanish. I've been practicing for an hour every day for the last 2 years, and it's been really fascinating for me in a number of ways. One is, the ability to connect with other people. I can, now speak to, or try to speak to, a large number of the world's population that perhaps don't speak English. I think the other thing that's been really fascinating for me is learning a lot about English as a language as well, and some of the limitations and strengths that English has also in comparison to, say, Spanish. I talk about things like, the sharing around emotion, how there are many words in Spanish to describe emotions, whereas English has less words potentially in that space. That's my opinion of that. So maybe English has been more cut down to be more simple, perhaps, you could say, or to use more, more of those simple words potentially. So I think that's really interesting for me. And obviously there's an array of words in English that we can use, but I think just generally speaking about that around emotion. I think the other thing that's been fascinating for me is examples like, going to visit a friend who I spent some time living in Argentina. There I met a French guy, Julian, and I went to go and visit last year. He lives in Grenoble now. I was in Europe and went to go and visit him, and then we did some camping trip. In this is in the east of France, Grenoble, so in the region there. And it was really interesting because his father didn't speak English, but he spoke French and Spanish. And for me, what was interesting there was previously I would never have been able to connect with this person. I mean, of course, there are shared experiences like food and so on where we can connect with them, right? But in a really deeper way, I couldn't connect with this person then. But now, of course, I could. And that was, for me, was probably one of the most motivating moments, where it wasn't even in a Spanish-speaking country per se, but it was really motivating in the sense of I was able to communicate with another person, I was able to connect with them. And in fact, we did a hike that was 2 or 3 hours long, and throughout that whole time we were able to communicate in Spanish, which was really interesting. I mean, I think that's something that's very powerful for me, and that's really motivating when I have these conversations with people. I mean, in Melbourne, there are many people that speak Spanish also, Spanish speakers, so that's also something that's very powerful for me. And I think language is something that I'm very curious to potentially do a third language. I think it's opened up so many different connections for me. And again, it comes back to some of these, you mentioned values before, have my values changed? I think it comes back to some of these core values around curiosity, around understanding different cultures in the world, connecting with people. I think learning a language will do all of those things. And it's really interesting and fascinating to be able to connect with people and also understand a little bit about our own language as well.
You were talking about how for 2 hours you were communicating with this gentleman. How would that have looked had you not spoken any Spanish?
It would have been very awkward, I think. I mean, of course, you can communicate through body language, and much of our communication is indeed through body language in any language. But I think it lessens the depth
Correct.
of the connection that we were able to have. So I think it was incredibly interesting for me, incredibly motivating. I remember coming away from that trip and thinking that was a really cool experience. I think something that's really important for me is a gratefulness journal. And I keep a gratefulness journal, and that was definitely number one from that trip was the ability to connect with his father and the ability to just have a deeper connection with someone in a different language. We often assume that people will always speak English when we travel, particularly in Europe, but the reality is they don't. And sometimes it's better anyway, even if they do speak English, to speak to them in their native language anyway. Yeah.
And you are at B2 level approximately,
Yes.
which is professionally proficient. It's quite a high level actually of fluency. At what level would someone need to reach in any language from A1 to C2 to actually feel a bit of connection with the local population?
I think we can always, even from the very start, I think for me, language learning is about giving up our ego and about being willing to make mistakes. I think as an English speaker, as a native English speaker, a lot of the narrative that we get told is that other people will have to learn English, that our language is the best, etc., etc. But the reality is those things, in my opinion, are not true. I think it's really important that we do learn languages in English-speaking countries or English-first-speaking countries. And I think that it definitely broadens our cultural understanding, our horizons, etc., etc., and the ability to connect with other people. In my opinion, I think that you can always connect through each of the levels. I think A2 is a level that I was able to have some, reasonably basic conversations with people. I think, of course, as you get to B1, you start to see much more improvement in the level of conversations that you can have, and of course then B2 as well. But I even think as an A1 speaker, if you learn a few words, a few phrases in the local language, people will always appreciate that as well. Even saying thank you, for example, or good morning, or very simple phrases in the country that you're going to is incredibly powerful and connects you instantly with that person. So yeah, for me, I would say that I think A2 was the level where I would start to have some of these more deeper conversations. But I think, as you get into the B levels, definitely you can have much stronger conversations. But I think to achieve those levels is also a challenge. I think the number of hours. I don't know the exact number of hours to go from A1 to B1, but it's quite a number of hours. So I think that I don't want to put people off language learning by saying you have to be B1 or B2 to have conversation with people. I think you can still do that at the start of the language as well.
They say that when you speak to a man in your language, I'm sure you heard of it goes to his head. When you speak to a man in his language, it goes to his heart.
Yes.
And speaking of that, I have a couple friends who picked up language learning for the reason of broadening or deepening their ability to socially connect. Do you have any tips for anyone on how they can accelerate their language learning in any language? What worked for you, what didn't?
Yeah. I think we often talk about immersion, of course, is very important. I think that's critical. But immersion is also, I think, you can move to a country and not learn a language. Right? You can pick up words. You can only read signs so many times and understand what that means, or order a coffee so many times, or in a restaurant. The reality is you also have to do lots of practice, and you have to be willing to make mistakes. I think for me, the biggest tip to anybody is to give up their ego in this space and think about that mistakes are actually really important, and they're a really important learning opportunity. Something that's worked particularly well for me is speaking from the first week. trying to force yourself to speak the language. It's very difficult.
It takes a lot of
challenging.
guts.
Absolutely, it's very challenging. But I think that has led me to, and the reality is, the spoken language is much older than written language. The reality is written language in relation to Homo sapiens is not that old. But spoken language, of course, is very, very old. And there are languages where there is no written form. So I think that's also interesting because, we often practice this, the safer skills to practice, if we can call them those, would be writing and reading, because then we don't have to show our mistakes to others, right? So I think the ability to be able to listen, there's 4 skills in a language, of course. The ability to listen and speak is incredibly important. And I think embedding that within week 1, within their practice, podcasts, trying to speak to native speakers, trying to get conversation partners as well. There are many apps for this also. I think Preply has been amazing for me to have a tutor, okay? And then balancing that with being motivated and not trying to do too much as well, I think is another thing. But for me, I think the book Atomic Habits, that book has been incredibly powerful for me. And around, coffee 80 or something, I started to read that book, and I sort of reflected on, I'm kind of going through a process of this book by doing these coffees each week. But it also showed me the power of doing small things each day. And for me, the hour a day, and I understand an hour is quite a lot, but even if it's 15 minutes, 20 minutes of a language, I think that will help versus doing 3 hours on a Friday, for example. One of the challenges with that, of course, is that you might have a great day on Friday and everything goes really well and you're really motivated to continue with the language, or you might have a bad day on Friday for whatever reason, you didn't sleep well, nothing to do with the language, and then you give up because you're not motivated and you didn't have good progression. So in class, or you didn't feel good. So I think it's important to practice as much as you can, even if it's for a small amount of time, and that's more motivating. And also to meet people also doing the language. I think motivation is a big piece in this. The more people you can meet that are studying the language, and this is where group classes are particularly important, I think, and interesting, because you meet other learners at the same level, you're on a journey together, you work together, you become a team, right? It's a community there as well. There are also communities of language learners, so you can really dig into some of these things and enjoy the process. It is fun, and I think once you sort of get past the making mistakes and you see that as kind of fun or part of the journey, that's a funny part of the journey. I remember for me in my second week in Buenos Aires, I spent 3 months in Buenos Aires at the start of the language learning journey. We'd learned in class how to order a coffee and so on, and I felt confident. I thought, right, I've got this. I know all the words that could be said to me in this cafe. I'm going to go and order my coffee. There was a massive line walking in to get to the very popular cafe in Buenos Aires, and ordered the coffee in Spanish, and they asked me if I want cinnamon. Now, I didn't know the words. Canela is the word for cinnamon. I didn't know the word cinnamon, and it kind of really, so my brain kind of froze. But that was kind of a funny moment for me. I just said yes, and I ended up with coffee. I don't really like cinnamon in coffee, so I ended up with a cappuccino with cinnamon. But I think that was a moment for me where I was like, that was quite a funny moment. And I think you have to embrace those moments and think like, that was really funny. I'm never going to forget that word now for cinnamon. I'll never forget that. So I think those are the moments, and that's also really important for people as well, is to make mistakes. I
would echo your sentiments that just being vulnerable, it's a very tough one, but definitely I'm also professionally proficient in Hindi and Arabic, and because of that I was able to communicate with more people, and I think the scope of people you can communicate with opens up. Speaking of which, normally when people reach professional proficiency in a language like you, they pick up another language. You are looking to pick up a third language. What is that third language you're inspired by, and why do you think you're inclined towards commencing study there?
Yeah, thank you. I think for me, honestly, I'm not sure. I'm thinking about a few languages. Mostly it's related to friends and the languages friends speak. I think that you have to be interested in a culture to learn a language.
Yes.
I think that's incredibly powerful as well, and really motivating and you do learn a lot about culture when you learn the language. So yeah, maybe it's a few friends are talking about Arabic. Norwegian is another language as well. I have spent quite a bit of time there and have a very close friend who's Norwegian, so maybe Norwegian. But there are other, I think the Romance languages also would be easier, in inverted commas. I don't think learning any language is easy. Would be easier for me in the sense of having learned Spanish, and with some of the grammar rules are very similar. Of course, in French, Italian, Portuguese, etc. But I do think that for me, my goal isn't to reach B2 proficiency in a third language. It's just to continue to be curious, continue to learn, and maybe the goal is to reach B1 or something like that. But I think again, my goal was never to reach B2. My goal was to do an hour a day of practice, and I think committing to the hour a day has been better than saying my goal is to achieve B2 or whatever that might be. And it's much the same for the Coffees project. The idea was never to do the TEDx talk or to start the nonprofit or to go to Cambridge or any of this stuff. The idea was to meet a stranger a week for coffee and do that for 100 weeks. And there was no end goal other than that. And I think that has been one of the reasons why that project has been so profound and so important to me. And I think also it's tied to the same thing with language learning as well. I've committed this 1 hour a day, and therefore I've achieved this result, which is, it surprises me sometimes as well. And I wouldn't say I'm fluent in Spanish for sure, but I have a lot of work to do in that area. But I think committing to something and just being consistent, and this is what this book, Atomic Habits, is all about. If anyone hasn't read that book, I recommend that book.
Yeah, I recommend it too. It's nice.
So yeah.
You were talking a little bit about, if you don't mind, maybe you can briefly touch on your TED Talk. That was also about social connection. What inspired you to do a TED Talk? That's a big step. It requires a lot of guts. What was that process looking like?
Yeah, so at the end of the 100 coffees, or around coffee 95, 94, people started to talk to me about the project and said, this needs to be something. I remember meeting one of the founders of Movember in the office, and we were talking about this, and the project needs to be something, and I was kind of thinking, be what? Like I've just met 100 people, it's not really that interesting. But he was saying to me that this is a story about social connection, there are these problems in society, and I'd reflected a little bit on that, but not that much, to be honest. So it was around coffee 95, I started to think about, this could be very interesting. In parallel, I also started going to these events around social enterprise. I became interested in this idea of social enterprise, starting a social enterprise. I became interested in the idea of grassroots change and grassroots work. I just started to become sort of curious around that. I met quite a few people in that space, and those things sort of intersected. And I did a post at the end of the 100, and it was actually my mum who spoke to me and said, this is a great concept. This could be something really interesting. And I thought, it could be interesting. Maybe I'll do a post on LinkedIn. Let's see what comes back, right? And after doing the post and summarizing my learnings around the 100 coffees, a lot of people reached out to me, much more than I expected. I was asked to be on quite a few podcasts, and then TED also reached out to me and said, we'd love you to do a TED talk about this project, or a TEDx talk about this project. And so that was quite a shock for me, because public speaking was something I was okay at, but I would not say comfortable. So I think the process was amazing. There was lots of speaker, big shout out to the speaker coach. There was lots of coaching for the speakers. And it was just a great and interesting process for me to go through over 12 weeks, finalizing the script. What do you want to talk about? Using the arc that they use in TED's talks. And then, having the speaker coaching as well, practicing the talk, unlearning the talk a little bit at the end, having the talk on a podcast, all these sort of things that actors use to learn their lines and so on. I think it was really interesting. So that to me was incredibly powerful process. In terms of the talk itself, the focus was on the 100 coffees, the rules, what did I learn, but then also the implications for society. And you have to remember that this talk was before COVID. So for me, what's fascinating about this project was that many of the things I talked about have become more pronounced. And I think COVID has helped me in many ways, and my career and my legitimacy in this space, and the interest in this project, because it happened before COVID. And then obviously, loneliness, for example, and we talk about loneliness in 2019, I think it was a bit abstract for people. Many people would have thought about loneliness as being something that older people experienced only, for example. Okay.
Younger people experience it at very high rates nowadays.
Yes, exactly.
Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think loneliness is experienced by all groups. I think back to the previous point. I think post-COVID, loneliness has become a conversation for all groups to have. The World Health Organization recently released a report into global social connection. It's quite interesting. If anyone's interested in this report, you can find that on the WHO website. The Parliament of New South Wales also did an inquiry into social connection in the state of New South Wales. And Australians aged 18 to 35 are actually considered amongst the loneliest, if not the loneliest group in the world, which is quite interesting. And I think the reasons why we see youth loneliness are, at the moment, I think there's we've started talking a lot in this space around purpose, and loss of purpose and existential loneliness and these sorts of topics. And I think it's a very difficult time to be in that age group. I think that there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of volatility, the cost of living, the things that are happening in the world, politics, etc. I think it's a very difficult time, and I think that we know the importance of purpose and having purpose. And I think that young people feel that some of their purpose has been taken away. And when people don't have purpose, they can feel lonely, and they may seek other purposes as well, some of which are not good, some of which are good. So I think that's part of the reason why we see loneliness in young people. And of course, I mean, social media has incredibly negative impact in this area. There are a lot of positives around social media, the ability to meet people, the ability to join different groups, etc., and the ability for marginalized groups to find people also going through similar challenges to them as well. That's also very important to call out as well. But I do think that social media has had a significant impact on the way that we connect with each other or don't connect with each other. And I think that these things are all factors that I think that we're all guinea pigs in an experiment. And I mean, I believe that social media and mobile phones could one day be banned. I think that, some of my colleagues or some people I've met describe this as the smoking of today, social media. So I think, in the idea that social smoking was initially considered good for us, there was a lot of lobbying and so on against research in that area, and then of course it's found to be incredibly dangerous. And I think that some people talk about social media in the same way. So I think social media is a big factor, and definitely the closing of third spaces and community spaces as well is something that I think and that's a lever that the government can also look at there.
You're talking about the value of grassroots.
Yeah.
Where do you see that value?
Yeah, for me, I think social change comes from grassroots. I think the government have the ability to pull certain levers, but the reality is often they are removed from the problem. Okay. And I think that their understanding of the problem is very different to the people that are experiencing it, unfortunately. So I think that we see in politics around the world, we have agendas and so on that are not necessarily related to the best interests of individuals and communities. Okay, so that's the reality that we live in. And I think that we need to have grassroots-led solutions, because the people working at grassroots level understand deeply the problem. Many times they have a lived experience of the problem, or they work with people who are experiencing the issue, a lived experience, and they have an understanding of what the solution might be that's culturally appropriate, that's appropriate to the local area, etc., rather than having people in the government who are not connected to the problem deciding and making policy and solutions as well. I think particularly in Australia, this is interesting for me. The other thing, to mention grassroots is grassroots will have a community focus straight away. One of the challenges in Australia, I think, with tackling loneliness in general is that the approach medically here, and I've talked to quite a few doctors about this and quite a few mental health professionals about this, is it's quite individualized. The approach to this is very individualized, and the reality is we need a holistic approach. We need to think about many different things. The factors that influence the mental health crisis that we have in this country, they're not individual factors. There are some individual factors, of course, but there are factors around community. We can talk about, capitalism, etc. I don't want to blame capitalism for all of our issues, but I think there are certain things from capitalism that we can take and say, or we should challenge and say, do we need that? I think that, or can we change that as well? And I think these are bigger picture conversations that require a lot of input from various different groups and parts of government, rather than just the medical side. So I think the individualization of social problems is a huge problem, and that's where grassroots doesn't do that, because grassroots, the focus is on community, the focus is on bottom-up solutions rather than top-down solutions. I reflect a lot on the work of Professor Neil Stott at the University of Cambridge, who has been incredibly influential and important to me in my career and life also. A person I met in 2018 at Cambridge that then helped me to become a student at the University of Cambridge. And if I reflect on the work of Professor Stott, he was a social worker for a number of years. He then was involved in a cooperative in the UK, in starting a cooperative. And I think, a lot of grassroots-led work and solutions. And I think that, reflecting on his sort of work and people like Neil, I think that it's showing me the success of grassroots-led solutions versus the top-down solutions. I mean, even in my own experience during COVID, running a food bank with Friends for Vulnerable People, mostly for international students, we came up against a number of government institutions or council that tried to close the project down, that said the project was dangerous, that didn't have an understanding of what was happening on the ground. And that to me was incredibly interesting, because you almost have to I had to act as an activist almost against the institutions in some ways in order to get this project off the ground and working. And the police were fantastic in doing that as well. So big shout out to Victoria Police during that time. So I think that's something that for me is interesting. I think that grassroots-led solutions will always place the community at the heart of the solution. They'll work with people with lived experience, and they have an understanding of the communities in which they work. And I think what government can do to assist that is introduce legislations that make it easier for grassroots organisations to start, to be maintained, remove some of the red tape around that, and provide funding. I think giving up control is really important for governments as well, and giving control to grassroots leaders that understand their communities. That to me is the answer to the problems that we're talking about here today in social connection and in mental health more broadly in this country.
I mean, grassroots is It's when people have boots on the ground. It's where belonging starts, relationships, friendship, kinship, whatever it is. People actually have proper insight into what's happening.
Yes.
So people don't slip through the gaps.
Yes.
Unlike in policy, legislative, it's very broad.
Yeah.
People.
Well, I'd love to hear a little bit about social threads. Give you the opportunity to talk about that.
Social
and how
threads, basically, it's a grassroots solution as well. And the whole idea is to basically empower people with skills, tools, knowledge, and resources to create deep and meaningful social connections. So I thought that it's great that people have meetups and events. I think this is a band-aid solution. It's short-term to social connection. I think what's great is we have workshops, we have sessions where people form friendships, and I try and design the workshops in such a way that friendships are formed. But more importantly, in the long term, people are empowered with skills, tools, resources, and knowledge to broaden their connections and deepen their connections. It's a very simple solution, but I feel like a problem like this can be addressed at a simple, fundamental level.
Yes, absolutely. No, it's fantastic what you're doing.
Thank you,
great.
sir.
I mean, this is exactly what I'm talking about. Grassroots led, people on the ground that understand the problem, and that's it's incredibly important. So keep that up.
And also, if you don't mind me adding, there are 3 vulnerable groups to loneliness. We're seeing that obviously it's young people, it's everyone nowadays actually.
Yep.
But the 3 vulnerable groups are international students, migrants, and older people.
Yes.
I work closely with older people in geriatrics as a hospital social worker. I was an international student at one point, and now I'm a migrant. Now I'm a permanent resident. So I have good insight. So with this experience, I believe that I'll be able to make more informed ways of actually designing these workshops.
Definitely, absolutely. No, it's fantastic what you're doing. I think that those 3 groups face different issues in relation to loneliness, and many of those are structural factors as well. But it's also how society view those groups as well. I mean, if we look at older people, I think that we can think about them in a different way in this country. We often see people as useful to society when they're working, but it's really important that, but then when they retire, they're no longer considered as a use to society, which I think is an incredibly dangerous mindset to have. And I think that much of that is led by the hyper-capitalist perspective as well. But I think that we can also improve how we think about our older people. We think about some other countries and the respect culture that they have, Japan, for example, South Korea, etc. I mean, even in Southern Europe, the idea of putting an older person in a home, for example, in Southern Europe it's not as common, right? For reasons around collectivism, etc. So I think there are some things that we can learn there from those societies.
Sir, this has been an absolutely wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your insight. And normally at the very last part of this chat, I ask the person who's sitting opposite to me for a general piece of advice that someone can benefit from. However, considering a large chunk of this chat was about social connection, I thought maybe you could share 3 quick and simple tips for someone who's looking to be a little more socially connected, especially if maybe they're a bit shy or introverted.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for having me. Really appreciate you having me on. Really great conversation. Really enjoyed it. So thanks first of all for that. Really appreciate it. In terms of the tips, I think first of all the main tip is to really think about like the connections that you have. I think first of all to be self-aware of the importance of this. As I said earlier, we know the importance of social connection for longevity. We know the importance around happiness. We know the importance of social connection for many things to thrive. Okay, so I think being aware of that first of all is something that's really important. And considering your own connections that you have, your own friendships, I like to think about that we have 3 layers of friendship. We have the close friends, the less close friends, and then the third group of friends who are still very important, by the way. So thinking about our own social connections that we have there as well. So that's my first tip, is to be self-aware of this, and also to consider and to maybe do some reflection on those social connections that we have. Another one is to try to volunteer or be involved in our community. Okay, and we know that this is an antidote for loneliness. We know that. We know that when people volunteer with people that they don't know, because caring is a very different thing, okay? There's a positive impact on mental health. So in some way, if there's a way to volunteer, if there's a way to give back to your community, this is incredibly powerful. And I think this is a really important tip to connect with, not only with others, but also with ourselves. And we can tie that back to purpose. This is really giving us purpose. It gives us good energy, etc., etc. And I think the third tip is to get to know the people around us, and that might start by knowing who your neighbors are. I think there's a statistic that is incredibly sad for me, is that most Australians don't know their neighbours. Now, to me, that's very sad, and I think that it's really important that we start to move away from that. So I think getting to know your neighbours. We saw in COVID the importance of knowing our neighbours, and many neighbours helped each other and helped their communities. So I think that's incredibly important. So yeah, getting to know your neighbours and reflecting on the importance of social connection, volunteering, and getting to know the people closest to us, as in our neighbours and so on as well in our community.
Beautiful. Chris, thank you so much for sharing your insights. I'm sure that anyone who's listening to this or watching this will learn a thing or two that's new.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.